Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing some examples of loops in Python, and in particular I'm going to be showing you some while loops, for loops, and nested loops. In programming, a loop is a chunk of code that you can repeat over and over until you've done it a certain number of times or until some condition has been met. So basically it's a chunk of code that you can repeat, and you get to decide how long you want to repeat it for. So the basic structure is that you check some condition, you do some code, you check the condition again, and then you continue this process. And you repeat this until the condition becomes false. So as long as the condition is true, you continue running the code that is inside of the loop. So now I'm going to demonstrate some examples of this, and I'm going to be using this web-based Python editor called trinket.io/python3. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this print statement that prints hello world, and instead I'm going to create a while loop. So a while loop needs to check some condition, and most likely you want to have some variable that you can use for that condition. So I'm going to create a variable called I equal to 0, and then I'm going to write a while loop while I is less than 10, and then I'm going to print I is currently, and then the value of I. Now, if I run this right now, it's going to print I is currently 0, and it's going to print that forever. This is an infinite while loop, and we don't want that. So what we want to do is we want to have our code inside of the while loop do something to update our condition. We want our condition inside the while loop to eventually become false. We don't want a situation where whatever is inside of these parentheses for the while loop is always true. We need to make sure that the while loop can end naturally. And so in order to do that, we need to update the value of I. So we'll do I plus equals 1. And so now we have I is currently 0, I is currently 1, all the way up to I is currently 9. Now just to show it does matter what order these are in, so if I move this I plus equals 1 to the beginning, and I do this before the print statement, then if I run this, now it actually starts printing as I is currently 1, and it goes all the way up to I is currently 10. If we think through and step through how this works, so we start with I has a value of 0, that is true. So what we're doing is we're thinking this while loop is currently true. I is 0, 0 is less than 10, this is true. We add 1, so now I equals 1, we print it out, and then we loop. We come back up to the top of the loop, and so now I is 1, 1 is still less than 10, so we add 1 again, and then we print again. Now I equals 2. 2 is still less than 10. So we continue and we do this process again all the way up until I equals 9. When I equals 9, 9 is less than 10. That's correct. That's true. So we add 1. So now I equals 10. We print it out. When we loop back up to the top, when I equals 10, 10 is not less than 10. So this condition is now false and the while loop ends. So that's how a loop works. It runs until its condition is no longer true. So that's how you write a while loop. I also want to show you an example of a for loop. A for loop lets you loop through a collection of things. So if you think about if you have a collection of, say you have a range of numbers. So you have a range of numbers from 0 up to 10. You can loop through each number in that range. You could also loop through the letters in a word. So let me try an example where you loop through the letters in a word. So we can do for letter in, and then we want our word to be a string, so I'm going to use the single quotes, and I'm going to say hello, and still using the colon. So what this does is it loops through each item in this collection. This collection is a collection of letters, so it is looping through each letter in this collection of letters, and so we could print that letter. And so the way this one is working is the first letter in the collection is H. And so while we're inside this loop, the letter is currently H. And so then we loop back to the top and we update the letter. So the next letter is E. And then we work with the letter E. So we could do some other stuff in here. For example, I could check if the letter is equal to L. So we're going to have two L's in here. And then we could add another print statement here. the letter is L. And so now if I run this, check out what happens now. So all of the code inside of the loop is going to run each time we loop through it. But this condition is only going to happen certain times. So in this case, we're only going to happen when we have the letter L. So we have H, E, L, and then it prints the letter as L. Then we have another L, so it prints the letter as L again. And then we have O, and nothing happens for O. And then the loop ends naturally because we have run out of letters. So that's how you can loop through letters in a word. I mentioned you can also loop through numbers in a range. So we could have for x in range 10, print x is currently, and then x. So this is going to, x is a temporary variable that only exists inside of this. While we are looping through this, we are using it to store the value of each number in this range. So x is currently, and then the value of x at the beginning is 0. So the range starts from 0 and goes up to, but not including that top number. So the last value of x will be 9. Now let's say that we want to loop through the numbers in a range, and then inside of this we also want to loop through the letters in a word. This is called a nested loop when we have a loop that is inside of another loop. So I'm going to loop 10 times on the outside loop, but then on the inside I'm going to loop through the letters in the word red. And I'm going to print the letter. And let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And so now we can kind of get a sense of how this inner loop is working. So when x is 0, so we're looping the first loop, x is 0, we loop all the way through the inside loop. So we go R, E, D, we loop all the way through the inside loop. Then the outer loop comes back up to the top, and we actually start the whole thing over again with an updated value of x. So now x is 1, and the inner loop runs again. So the inside loop is going to run every time the outside loop runs, and the inside loop is actually going to run to completion each time. So I could do some other things in here, and I could print the letter and the number together. And actually, I'm going to add the very first thing up here. I'm going to print inner loop is starting. And so now I can see that I can add some other things that happen inside of my inner loop. So x is currently 0, the inner loop is starting, I print R, this is just the letter, and then I print R0. Then the inner loop is starting again. So here we looped up to the top again, and then we have E. So the inner loop runs 3 times, once for each letter. One thing that's important to note is that even if you're not doing anything with the letters, if you loop through each letter in a word, it is going to loop that many times. So rather than printing the letters, I don't even have to print the letters. Instead of printing the letters, I can just print the inner loop is starting. And if I run this, we can see the inner loop is starting prints 3 times. Each time the outer loop runs, the inside loop runs 3 times. So it doesn't matter if we're using this letter or not, it is still going to loop through each letter in the word, and so it will loop that many times. If I add extra letters here, let's just add 2 more letters, and now if I run this, my inner loop is starting print line is going to happen 5 times. So even though I'm not using the letter, it is looping through that many times. That's how many times this inner loop is going to run. Now I'm going to come back to print my letter so we can look at a little bit more in detail about how the outer loop is working. So I'm going to add a print up here. Outer loop is starting. And I'm going to add after the inner loop. So this inner loop is starting, prints each time the loop starts. But how do I know when the loop is finished? Well, when the inner loop is finished, it will come down here and it will continue with any other code inside of the outer loop. So this code is still going to run every time the outer loop runs, but it will only run once the inner loop is finished. So I could print here, inner loop is finished. And I'll go ahead and run this. And so now we can take a look at our output. So we see the outer loop is starting, x is currently 0. The inner loop is starting, then we get r. The inner loop is starting again. That means we've looped the inner loop one more time. Then it is e. The inner loop starts one more time. Then we get d, and then we get the inner loop. Sorry, the scroll jumps when I click on it. Then we get the inner loop is finished. So the order that things happen here, the outer loop is starting, we get the value of x, we have the inner loop is starting, and then we get the letter that we are currently on. We update the letters, so we're progressing through the letters in this word. We get the inner loop is starting each time, and then at the end, we get the inner loop is finished. Then the outer loop is starting again. So the outer loop loops again. We update the value of x. Then we one more time run all the way through the inner loop. So the inner loop is starting, we get r, e, and d, and then the inner loop is finished. One more time, the outer loop is starting, x is currently 2, and we run the inner loop through to completion again. And this happens all the way up until we get to x is currently 9. So this is the last value of x. And if we want to know when the outer loop is finished, so just like we did with the inner loop, we move this line. There's no indentation here from the for loop, so this is outside of the inner loop. We can do the same thing for the outer loop. So we'll remove this indentation. We're no longer inside of the outer loop, and so then we can print the outer loop is finished. So now when I run this, we can see everything happens exactly the same. The inner loop is finished, the outer loop is starting, x is currently 1, we loop through and do that again, the inner loop is finished, the outer loop is starting. So this happens every time we run through the outer loop. Then when we get down to the very last line, we have the outer loop is finished. So this is only printing once because it does not print until our outer for loop is completely done. And at that point, we're actually done with the program. So the program is no longer running at this point. This is the very last thing that happens. Just to add a little bit of clarity to inner loops, so I'm demonstrating this using for loops, but you can also do nested loops using a while loop, or you can mix and match. So you could have a for loop and a while loop. So I'm going to give one more example. So I'm going to do x equals 0 and y equals 10. And then I'm going to do a while loop while x is less than 5. And we want to make sure that we are always updating the value that we are using in our condition. So I'm going to say x plus equals 1 right now, just so I can make sure that that is going to happen. And I'm going to print x is currently, and then the value of x. Now I'm going to have a nested while loop. So I'm going to say while y is greater than 0. So y is going to count backwards. So x is less than 5. That means x, we're going to count upwards. Y is greater than 0. So y starts at 10, and we're going to count downward. So we're going to do y minus equals 1. And then I'm going to print the value of y is, and then y. So let me go ahead and run this so we can take a look. So here, so we have something interesting happening here. So x is currently 1. That's great. So we added 1 before we print this line. So x equals 0 at the beginning. 0 is less than 5. That's true. We add 1 to x. Now x is currently 1. Then we have y is currently 10. So 10 is greater than 0. We subtract 1. So the value of y is 9. We loop through, we keep looping. So y minus 1 each time. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Once we get down to a y equals 0, 0 is not greater than 0, so we are done. we loop back up to get x plus equals 1, so now x is 2. However, notice the while loop in here did not run again. That's actually because y is still equal to 0. We have not reset the value of y. So if we wanted y to reset at each time the outer loop runs, we would need to add y equals 10 right above this while loop. So now y will get reset to 10 each time the outer loop runs. That way the inner loop can run 10 times. And so now we have the expected behavior. So we have x is currently 1, then the value of y is 9, 8, 7, all the way down to 0. Once y equals 0, this loop is finished, and so we come back up to the top and we add 1 to x, and then we print the value of x, we reset y to 10, and then we do the inner loop again. I will once again show the start and end points of the loop. So we'll do the outer loop is starting, and then the inner loop is starting. Now note that this inner loop is starting, the outer loop is starting. This actually prints every time we loop, every time we come back up to the top. So the loop happens, this print statement happens every time we loop. And then in order to have something that happens only once at the end, so I could remove the indentation from the inner loop. So now that means the inner loop has ended. The inner loop has ended. And similarly to last time, if we remove all of the indentation, we can then print the outer loop has ended. And we'll go ahead and run this, and we'll take a look at what we have. So the outer loop is starting. So this happens right as soon as we enter the outer loop. So then we add 1 to x, we print out the current value of x, which is 1. Then it says the inner loop is starting. So we have entered the inner loop. We print the value of y. Well, y is currently 9. Then we loop the inner loop. We go back up. So we have subtracted 1, so now y is 8. We re-enter the inner loop. So the inner loop is starting again. So this happens every time the loop happens. So the inner loop is starting. We print the value of y. The inner loop is starting again. We print the value of y, which is now 7. We go all the way until y is 0. Once y is 0, 0 is not greater than 0. This condition is false. So now we progress to the this step here on line 14 where there's no indentation from this inner while loop. So that means the inner while loop has ended, and that's this print line right here. And so then we loop back to the top of the outer loop. So the outer loop is starting again. We have updated the value of x, so x is now 2. Then we do the inner loop all over again. So the inner loop loops all the way back down to 0. The inner loop has ended. We start the outer loop again. We continue until the outer loop completes. So once x equals 5, 5 is not less than 5, so the outer loop condition is false, and so then we print the outer loop has ended. So I hope this was helpful for you for understanding how while loops and for loops and nested loops work. And so you can play around with this. You can try different conditions. You can try mixing and matching. You can even add additional layers. So I've only shown 2 layers deep, but you could add another loop inside of the inner loop. So you are not limited to just 2 layers deep. It does get very complex if you continue adding additional layers, and so and your code also becomes a little bit harder to read. But you are not limited to how many layers deep you can go with your loops. So you can continue nesting loops further down. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you now feel a little bit more comfortable about using loops in Python. Thanks for watching.